Tu as peur des méchants esprits.
Oh, monsieur, oui, 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 oui. C'est l'Halloween.
Yeah, I hope that was a nice little throwback if you fall into the very specific demographic of Canadian children who took French immersion in elementary school. This Halloween, everyone, my throat is sore. This isn't good. That means I have to very quickly record this video before I get worse. I love being sick on Halloween. If you remember, I think exactly 15 years ago, during the swine flu outbreak, I would have been 11 years old and I actually had the swine flu during Halloween, and it really sucked. And, yeah, man, I hope you have all been enjoying your spooky season. I hope you've been watching lots of movies, reading lots of books. I know I have, and I actually have 6 books to talk to you about today. As you know, I kind of like to go all out for Halloween, and like to theme my reading around it. And as we reach the final day in October, I am here to tell you how it all went. Now, I may be sort of cheating with the first one here, but I wanted to give a quick shout out to Percy Jackson, Wrath of the Triple Goddess, because it is a Halloween book, and I didn't actually know that going in, so it was a nice little surprise. I've already made a mini review for this one, but unfortunately I wasn't like a massive fan of it. I thought it was alright. It definitely leaned a lot more into just, you know, the standard middle grade adventure type stuff, where the previous Percy Jackson book had a lot of like cool thematic and character stuff I really enjoyed. This one was just kind of like a goofy throwaway adventure. I did enjoy like the fall Halloween vibes and stuff though. I'm sure kids will still love it, and I'm definitely going to at least finish the trilogy off whenever the third one comes out. But moving on to the real stuff now, we got Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So of course this was a classic book. I believe it was written in 1818. Not the oldest book I've ever read, but you know, it's like double public domain. And it's definitely always one I've been interested in reading, especially after I read Dracula last year and really enjoyed that. Kind of wanted to see what all these other classic spooky stories were about. Now, Frankenstein's a very like iconic figure in pop culture, more so his monster, and thanks to that, I always had this picture of the Frankenstein story in my head. I mean, when it comes to these public domain creatures, like, their influence is just on a whole other level. So I was kind of shocked to discover that this is completely different from pretty much every other portrayal of Frankenstein I've ever seen. Bro doesn't even have an Igor in this one. But for those unaware, there's a story about a scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who discovers the secret of reanimating dead matter, and uses this knowledge to attempt to create another human from scratch. But because, like, human parts are so intricate, he's kinda gotta scale up his creation, so he makes this giant mush monster man. And once this thing comes to life, it kind of hates being alive, and decides to, you know, go off and let's say cause some mayhem. Frankenstein realizes he's made a big mistake, and now it's up to him to try to put a stop to this creature he created. He has no dark and spooky castles, no hunchbacks. He's not even like a mad scientist at all. He's just a guy. It was just very different from what I had come to expect. But I have to say, I really dug it. It's just a very interesting story about humanity and what makes something human. We spend a lot of time just following the creature, and it's really fascinating seeing this being sort of come into sentience and like how he perceives everything and, you know, what happens to him because of the way he is treated. And the narrative on its own is pretty engaging. You know, once this monster goes off, there's a lot of really creepy stuff. You know, Frankenstein deals with a lot of paranoia, as people are starting to turn up dead and he is not sure if he is to blame for it all. Standards for horror have changed over the years, but my god, I can imagine 200 years ago people were pissing their pants over this thing. I also really enjoyed the novelty of this being a science fiction book from that long ago. We are so far advanced in science than they were back then, so just seeing all this talk about human anatomy and electricity and stuff, talking about electricity like it's this new exciting thing, stuff I just found pretty interesting. And I'm sure 200 years from now, people will look back at the crap we're reading and think the same things. Probably the most impressive thing about Frankenstein to me is that Mary Shelley was 18 years old when she wrote this, and its prose is just so high quality and engaging. I know standards were very different back then, but even so, to think that all of this came from a teenage girl is nuts. It's nuts. And yeah, I can definitely see why this is a classic and why she is such a respected writer. I don't really know how the franchise got from here to like here, but you know, whatever. Frankenstein has become such a horror icon. Good for him, I suppose. So I read a lot of like nonsense smut with book club. You guys know this. Usually my friends who are more partial to series like this pick them, and I end up hating them. And for Halloween, we decided to read My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine. And it sort of exemplifies why I love my book club so much. Because, and believe me, this was a huge shock, this thing's a banger. Follows this girl Cassie, who's like a poor art graduate with no job, and she's looking for a really cheap place. She sees this apartment listed for $200 a month. And the guy who owns it is Frederick J. Fitzwilliam, who's a 300-year-old vampire or something. The twist is that he's actually been in a coma for the past 100 years, so he doesn't know how modern society works. So he decides to get himself a roommate so they can teach him. She quickly learns that he's a vampire because he forgot that humans use refrigerators, and he had it full of all of his blood bags. But you see, Cassie is just so attracted to Frederick J. Fitzwilliam that she decides to, you know, tag along with him and actually teach him how people act, how the modern society works. And you know, it sounds really dumb, and it is. It is extremely dumb. It is unfathomably dumb. But this book finally does something that so many of these nonsense book talk smut books are lacking, and that is self-awareness. Finally a book that knows it's really dumb, that leans into its silliness and actually has genuinely funny stuff in it. I really mean it when I say I thought this book was genuinely hilarious, and for the first time, not unintentionally. Seeing this ancient vampire try to adapt to modern society was genuinely really charming and funny. It was all extremely silly and over the top, but just as sort of like a fun, feel-good book, I really had a good time with it. And I feel a bit harsh actually calling this a smut book because there's really only one sex scene in it, and it is like the usual, very explicit, very over the top. But what I will say is that, again, for like the first time in one of these types of books I've read, they earned it, man. They earned it. When it started to get super descriptive, super explicit, all this nonsense was happening, I was like, you know what, man? Go for it. Have at it. And the fact that there was only one chapter in the book like that proves to me that, you know, porn was not the intention of this book. It was to just be a cute little rom-com, and I think it very much succeeded in that. Would I recommend this to people who have similar tastes to me? Probably not. But if you ever did want to read a vampire rom-com, yeah, I thought it was pretty delightful. I actually gave this 4 stars. But enough of that girly shit. Next up is Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. So I've read Cabin at the End of the World by this author. I really enjoy that book, and I've always been wanting to read more of his stuff, so I decided to pick up his newest book, not only because it was pretty short, but also I just found the premise to be super fascinating. So in this book we are following a character who is the last surviving member from the set of a horror movie that was shot in the 90s. It was a super low-budget independent film that never ended up getting released because of events that happened on set. Yet years later, when footage is leaked online, it develops a massive cult following, where a lot of people are, you know, making up headcanons and urban legends about this movie. And in the present now, our main character is getting contacted by Hollywood because, you know, they want to take this movie and actually turn it into a real thing. So half of the book follows this guy as he is navigating Hollywood and pop culture, and how he is dealing with all of this fame despite the trauma that happened to him on the set of this movie. Then we are also, of course, following the timeline back in the 90s when the movie was actually being filmed, so we're following the whole production there. And we're sort of jumping back and forth as more things are getting revealed. Fantastic premise. The vibes here are immaculate. It reminds me of stuff like the Blair Witch Project, you know, back then when people actually didn't know if it was real or fake. The whole phenomenon of, you know, cult hits, cursed movies, unreleased movies. Great stuff. Great stuff. And overall, I do think the book was pretty good. You know, the narrative kept me engaged. I was really on the edge of my seat just waiting to see how this movie's production goes so horribly, and yeah, it definitely paid off. You know, this is a really short book. There wasn't a ton to its characters, and I wasn't a huge fan of the very ending. I understand what Tremblay was going for, and I thought it was pretty cool of an idea, but it didn't really do much for me. I was just kind of left a bit confused by how it all wrapped up. job. So I gave this 3.5 stars. I still thought it was fairly solid, and if anything about that premise was interesting to you, I definitely recommend you check this one out. And I will for sure be reading more of his works at some point. I hear a lot of good things about Head Full of Ghosts, so that might be the next one I check out, but yeah, good stuff. In another return to an author that I read last year, we have Sundial by Catriona Ward. Her book, The Last House on Needless Street, was one of the biggest surprises of last year. I was told to go into it completely blind, and I was absolutely blown away by it. Sundial is another psychological horror book, and I'm not going to give too much away about the story, but I will say that it follows a mother and daughter in sort of a dual POV setup, where the mother discovers some very disturbing things about her daughter, and in order to face them, she takes them out into the desert to her family home of Sundial. And from there we get a very disturbing tale all about trauma. I do love me some good generational trauma, man. If you are familiar with this author's work, like, you know why I want to be so tight-lipped about this. It is an absolutely wild roller coaster, full of twists and turns and unreliable narration. It's not as complicated as Needless Street was, I don't think, but yeah, it was still extremely engaging, entertaining, and I definitely like this book as much as that one. And I think this might actually be a better starting point for new readers than Needless Street was, just because I do think it is a bit more streamlined. But yeah, I continue to be extremely impressed with Ward's work here, and I have a few other books from her. Definitely going to be checking those out. Grew up in the United States, Kenya, Madagascar, Yemen, and Morocco. Damn, okay. And look, we got Paul Tremblay here. Nice little crossover. It's like they knew. And the final book we have to talk about today is one that I have been excited to read for years. Needful Things by Stephen King. This is one of the few super iconic King books that I had yet to read, and so I finally made an effort to do so. For those unaware, this is a story that takes place in his town of Castle Rock. It was at the time advertised as the final Castle Rock story, which turned out to be a lie, but this thing is sort of like the culmination of all of the stories that have taken place in Castle Rock up to this point. It gives us this nice, chunky, creepy story about a little store called Needful Things. Yes, the mysterious Leland Gaunt rolls into town one day and sets up this curious little store selling all sorts of weird little knickknacks. And what the citizens of Castle Rock find when they enter Needful Things is that this store seemingly has everything they could ever want. And Mr. Gaunt, being a very generous man, is willing to give it to them. But instead of asking for money as a price, he wants something else. It's a very famous story. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the Rick and Morty episode about it. And we're just sort of following all of the citizens of Castle Rock as they descend into madness under the influence of Leland Gaunt and the nifty little artifacts he sells at his store. Our main character is Alan Pangborn, who is the sheriff of Castle Rock. He's been in a few stories before, most notably The Dark Half, who is in a very dark place at the start of this book because of events that happened before the story. And now he's sort of thrust into this new conflict with everyone seemingly going crazy and the town going to shit, and it's a real chaotic nightmare for everyone involved. So yeah, this is for sure classic King. It's got all the stuff you know and love about his works. Castle Rock, I mean, it's been developed over several books at this point, but it is for sure one of his most iconic locations. Like, this town feels so alive and lived in. All of the characters are super rich, super believable. Alan Pangborn, I think, is easily one of King's probably best characters ever. And Leland Gaunt as well. I mean, talk about a creepy villain. And you never really learn too much about him and know the extent of what he can do, which makes him all the more scarier. And, you know, this is all around just a really solid, engaging story all the way through. Now, I did give this 4 stars. Not one of my favorite King books. I think while it had some very excellent qualities to it, most of it was just kind of standard King, and standard King is very good, and I love it. But I just think it didn't really have a lot of the iconic moments, like iconic skin-crawlingly creepy stuff that fill so many of his better books. People may disagree, but I feel like this was just him doing what he does well, but just didn't really go above and beyond like he sometimes does. And I think maybe it was sometimes a bit too goofy. A lot of terrible things happen in King's books, and they normally make me feel scared or feel feel dread. I mean, there were some moments I think meant to evoke those feelings in this book, but I might have found them a little funny. Would still highly recommend this though. I also recommend reading like all of the Castle Rock stories up to this point, because I definitely think you'll get a lot more out of it if you've read like The Dead Zone, Cujo, The Dark Half. One thing worth noting, I mean, like, this is a thick book. This is one of his bigger novels for sure. I thought the pacing was extremely great. The book is definitely comparable, I think, to Under the Dome, as it's, you know, a story about a town basically going to shit, going insane. Under the Dome was too long, had some pacing issues. This is a lot tighter, a lot faster paced. Just overall, really solid stuff, and I can definitely understand why some people rank it among his best works. So there you have it. I'm feeling a lot better now after recording this video. I know I'm going to have a massive crash. But with that, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a very happy Halloween. Let me know what you have been reading and watching throughout the month to celebrate. And after hearing my thoughts on these books, I'd also encourage some recommendations, as you know, this is how I discover a lot of the things I read. But for now, I will see you next time, because, and to all of my American viewers, good luck.